Tom Brady. Tom Brady is known as the greatest quarterback in NFL history, but his one weakness came in the form of Eli Manning. On two different Super Bowl stages, Brady's Patriots were heavy favorites, yet Manning's Giants stunned them both times. The first upset ruined New England's perfect 2007 season, sealed by David Tyree's miracle helmet catch. The second came in 2011, when Mario Manningham's sideline grab set up another heartbreaking loss. Brady thrived against nearly every other opponent, but he never figured out Eli in the moments that mattered most. For all his dominance, those two blemishes stand out on a spotless resume. The fact that a quarterback few ranked near Brady in all-time lists took him down twice is why Eli Manning remains Brady's defining weakness. Peyton Manning. Peyton Manning mastered the regular season, rewriting record books with his arm and football IQ. He won 5 MVP awards, orchestrated unstoppable offenses, and looked invincible from September through December. But when the playoffs arrived, that brilliance often evaporated. Manning finished with a 14-13 postseason record filled with stunning early exits when his teams were favored. He threw costly interceptions in big moments and struggled against defenses that adjusted under pressure. Even his 2 Super Bowl wins had caveats, one carried by his defense and another where he looked pedestrian. Critics seized on those failures, calling him a quarterback who shrank in the spotlight. Manning's playoff struggles remain the asterisk on an otherwise legendary career, showing how even the smartest passer of his generation had one glaring weakness: Brett Farve. Brett Farve embodied the gunslinger mentality. Fearless, tough, and willing to throw into any window. That daring style made him electrifying to watch, but it also defined his weakness: interceptions. Farve holds the NFL record for most passes picked off, finishing with 336. Sometimes his bold throws turned into legendary plays, but just as often they became backbreaking mistakes. In the 2009 NFC Championship, his interception across the middle in crunch time cost Minnesota a trip to the Super Bowl. For all the touchdowns, comebacks, and highlight reels, defenses always knew Farve could be baited into a risky throw. His confidence created unforgettable moments, but it also created disaster. Interceptions became the shadow of his career, the one thing his incredible talent never fully overcame. Aaron Rodgers. Aaron Rodgers' pinpoint accuracy, mobility, and decision-making made him look like the perfect quarterback, but his weakness became clear in NFC Championship games. Since winning his only Super Bowl in 2010, Rodgers has repeatedly faltered one step away from another title. He went 0-4 in those appearances, including a crushing 2014 collapse in Seattle where the Packers blew a late lead. In 2020, he had the ball against Tom Brady's Buccaneers and failed to capitalize on multiple chances. His regular season play often looked flawless, yet those high-stakes moments exposed cracks. Critics argue Rodgers' greatness never translated when the pressure was at its peak. For all his talent, his inability to clear that conference championship hurdle defines his weakness and leaves a hole in his legacy. Joe Montana. Joe Montana built a reputation as one of the greatest winners in NFL history, but injuries proved to be his kryptonite. His fearless style in the pocket, standing tall against fierce hits, left him vulnerable to brutal punishment. Montana suffered countless setbacks, from back issues to concussions, and his 1991 elbow injury cost him nearly 2 seasons. Those absences opened the door for Steve Young in San Francisco, forcing Montana to finish his career in Kansas City. While his 4 Super Bowl titles cemented him as a legend, his body ultimately betrayed him. Injuries robbed him of statistical padding and more years at the top. For a quarterback defined by toughness, Montana's weakness wasn't his mind or skill. It was the relentless toll on his body. Steve Young. Steve Young eventually became a Hall of Fame quarterback, but his late start was his biggest weakness. After beginning his career in the USFL, he was traded to the 49ers, where he spent years stuck behind Joe Montana. Despite his immense talent, Young was sidelined until his 30s before finally becoming San Francisco's starter. By then, he had less time to build the resume other greats had. Though he won an MVP and a Super Bowl, his career totals lacked the longevity of his peers. Those lost years kept him from challenging records or building a larger dynasty. Young's skills, accuracy, mobility, and leadership were never in doubt. What held him back was circumstance, leaving his late start the undeniable weakness in an otherwise brilliant career. Dan Marino. Dan Marino redefined passing in the NFL with his quick release and rocket arm, setting records that seemed untouchable. Yet his weakness remains the most famous in football history: no Super Bowl wins. Marino reached the big game once, early in his career, and never returned. Despite putting up legendary numbers, he often carried weak Dolphins rosters that couldn't keep up in January. Critics labeled him as the ultimate stat quarterback, someone who could dominate the regular season but never lift the Lombardi trophy. It wasn't all his fault, but the narrative stuck. Even decades later, Marino's brilliance is often overshadowed by that empty championship column. His weakness wasn't skill. It was the cruel reality that the NFL judges greatness by rings, not records. John Elway. John Elway ended his career on top with back-to-back Super Bowl wins, but for most of his playing days, his weakness was big game failures. In the 1980s, he led Denver to 3 Super Bowls, and each ended in embarrassing blowouts. The 49ers' 55-10 demolition in 1990 became a lasting stain on his legacy. For years, Elway was seen as a quarterback who couldn't win when it mattered most, a narrative that nearly defined him. Only in the late 1990s did he reverse course, finally capturing championships and rewriting his story. Still, those earlier failures never fully disappeared. His weakness was clear. Despite his talent and competitiveness, he spent the majority of his career falling short on the game's biggest stage. Drew Brees. Drew Brees carved out a career as one of the most accurate quarterbacks in NFL history, but as he aged, his arm strength became his fatal weakness. In his final seasons, defenses recognized he couldn't push the ball downfield. Teams crowded short zones, daring him to throw deep, knowing he no longer could. The 2020 playoff loss to Tampa Bay exposed this in painful fashion. Brees threw 3 interceptions, each showing the decline of his once lethal arm. His intelligence and touch remained sharp, but his body no longer matched his mind. For all the records, he finished his career hampered by limitations he couldn't overcome. But first, only cool people are subscribed to this channel, so hit that subscribe button before we go any further. Ben Roethlisberger. Ben Roethlisberger's size, toughness, and ability to extend plays made him one of the most dangerous quarterbacks of his era. But his weakness was never just on the field, it was the off-field issues that clouded his career. From disturbing accusations to reckless behavior, his reputation took multiple hits during his prime. The NFL even suspended him for violating its conduct policy, leaving the Steelers scrambling without their franchise quarterback. While he eventually regained much of his image with clutch performances and 2 Super Bowl rings, those controversies always followed him. Fans and analysts alike questioned his leadership and maturity, even as he piled up wins. For all his talent and accomplishments, Big Ben's legacy remains tied to the off-field problems that stained an otherwise remarkable career. Terry Bradshaw. Terry Bradshaw won 4 Super Bowls with the Steelers, but consistency was always his weakness. His career stats don't match his reputation, as he threw almost as many interceptions as touchdowns. For stretches of his career, Bradshaw's play was erratic, forcing Pittsburgh's legendary defense to carry the load. Even during his championship runs, he had games where his decision-making left fans frustrated. Critics at the time questioned whether he was truly elite or simply fortunate to be surrounded by one of the greatest supporting casts in NFL history. While his big game performances eventually silenced many doubters, his inconsistency never disappeared. Bradshaw's highs were unforgettable, but his lows were glaring. His weakness wasn't a lack of success, it was the unpredictable play that defined much of his career. Roger Staubach. Roger Staubach was one of the NFL's most beloved quarterbacks, known for his leadership and clutch play with the Dallas Cowboys. But his biggest weakness was the length of his career. Because of his military service after attending the Naval Academy, Staubach didn't play in the NFL until he was 27. By the time he hit his prime, he had already lost years that other quarterbacks spent building their legacies. He played just 11 seasons, retiring at 37 due to repeated concussions. His efficiency and winning record made him legendary, but the brevity of his career kept him from climbing statistical leaderboards or winning more titles. Staubach had the skill, the smarts, and the poise, but his weakness was time itself, a shortened career that limited his overall impact. Patrick Mahomes. Patrick Mahomes is already building one of the greatest resumes ever, but even he has a weakness: turnovers when he presses too much. His playmaking ability is unmatched, yet it sometimes leads him into forcing throws that aren't there. In 2021, he struggled with interceptions early in the season, as defenses adjusted by dropping extra men into coverage. His instinct to play hero ball, spinning out of sacks and firing across his body, can create highlights but also costly mistakes. While his talent usually overshadows these moments, even the Chiefs' high-powered offense stalls when Mahomes gets reckless. His weakness isn't frequent, but it shows up when he tries to do everything himself. For all his greatness, turnovers are the one area that still creeps into his game. Russell Wilson. Russell Wilson made a career out of improvisation, but that same creativity exposed his weakness, holding onto the ball too long. Rather than throwing it away, Wilson often tried to extend plays, waiting for something magical to develop. Sometimes it worked, but just as often, it ended in sacks or negative plays. In Seattle, this habit repeatedly exposed his offensive line to criticism, though much of it was his own doing. Even during his best years, Wilson's tendency to hesitate frustrated coaches who wanted quicker decisions. As he aged, the sacks piled up and his mobility declined, making the issue even worse. Wilson's greatness came from his ability to create out of chaos, but his weakness was his inability to let go when nothing was there. Troy Aikman. Troy Aikman led the Cowboys dynasty of the 1990s, but his weakness was his numbers. Unlike other great quarterbacks, Aikman's stats look ordinary. He threw only 165 touchdowns across 12 seasons, never leading the league in passing yards or touchdowns. His efficiency was solid, but he was never the type to put up gaudy production. Critics often note that his Hall of Fame legacy is tied more to the stacked roster around him, with Emmitt Smith, Michael Irvin, and a dominant offensive line, than his personal output. Aikman was a winner, but not a statistical monster. That contrast defines his weakness. He had the rings and the leadership, but his career totals leave him lagging behind peers, making his greatness harder to measure in numbers. Kurt Warner. Kurt Warner's story is legendary. From grocery store shelves to Super Bowl MVP, but his career had massive gaps that became his weakness. After his incredible run with the Rams' greatest show on turf, Warner's play collapsed. He lost his starting job, bounced between teams, and for years looked like a player who was finished. Only later, with the Cardinals, did he resurrect his career with another trip to the Super Bowl. The valleys in his career are what make him unique, but they also hurt his overall legacy. Unlike other legends who were consistently elite, Warner's greatness came in bursts separated by long droughts. His weakness wasn't talent, but sustainability. His career had peaks as high as anyone's, but the gaps were too glaring to ignore. Jim Kelly. Jim Kelly was the face of the Buffalo Bills' 4 straight Super Bowl appearances in the early 1990s. His fast-paced K-gun offense revolutionized the game, but his weakness was simple: he never won the big one. The Bills lost all 4 Super Bowls, including 2 heartbreakers and 2 blowouts. Fair or not, Kelly became defined by those failures. His leadership and skill were unquestioned, but fans remember him most for the losses. Critics argue he had the talent to win, yet history sees him as the quarterback of a dynasty without rings. His weakness wasn't effort, it was closing when it mattered most. Kelly's career was filled with brilliance, but the Super Bowl losses will always overshadow everything else he accomplished. Michael Vick. Michael Vick changed football with his speed and athleticism, but his weakness was never unlocking his full potential. With his legs, he was unstoppable, but his passing game lagged behind. Vick often relied too heavily on scrambling, and defenses eventually forced him into uncomfortable throwing situations. His inconsistent accuracy and decision-making limited how far his teams could go. Off-field issues also derailed his career, cutting into his prime and leaving fans wondering what could have been. While he returned later and reinvented himself in Philadelphia, the feeling never left. Vick could have been even greater. His weakness wasn't ability, but development. The tools were there to dominate forever, yet the promise never fully matched the results. If you like this video, consider watching this next one, which YouTube thinks you're going to really love.